Here's part 2. I didn't do anywhere near as much revising on this one as I did on the first, so forgive me if it's not quite as well written. Enjoy. Also, forgive me if this sounds like shit. I just came home from a fucking painful-ass shift that I didn't even need to be there for. Anyways, I'm rambling. The following Saturday, we returned to Woody's house, armed with pizza for dinner and the revelations of Kevin and Jenna's interview with Woody, which we'd listened to, discussed, transcribed, and practically memorized during idle moments of the week. All 4 of us were eager to get back there, and I'd been on the phone with Woody several times during the week. He cleaned up the basement, but at my request had left the rack lying flat on the floor, pushed into a corner with the paint cans stacked in the gaps between the shelves. I didn't want to risk injury or another mess from that stupid rack. Woody's interview gave us good details of the phenomena. Firstly, it was confined entirely to the basement and the stairs leading down to it. Footsteps were common on the stairs, and they occurred seemingly at random, always descending. Woody had counted them before, and by his reckoning there was always 22 steps taken down a flight that had only 12 actual steps. Cue the cheesy horror music. Low-tax avatars nearly made me piss myself about 4 times now. On 3 separate occasions that he could recall, he told us, he heard the footsteps coming down the stairs while he was in the basement. He saw nothing, and unsurprisingly, after experiencing this, he usually made a hasty exit. He was aware of the tapping sound. It was a high-pitched and had a ringing aftertone, as I described it previously, much like fork prongs tapping together. He also heard what he thought was the sound of someone heavily dragging their feet on the basement floor. This always occurred while he was in the basement on the far side where he kept the sawhorses and the abandoned workbench. He got up his nerve enough to take a look a few times and never saw anything. He told us that he and his wife had discussed the basement many times. She had it worse than he did. She experienced all of the phenomena he did, as well as a very sudden, noticeable drop in temperature in the basement. The feeling of anger Sarah experienced was also something she had reported, along with a strong sense of resentment, though about what exactly she could never figure out. On 3 separate occasions, she felt touches on her back, near the shoulder blades. She had told Woody they were light, persistent, and while not obviously hostile, they felt threatening. I should note at this point that he made it very clear most of the time the basement was just a basement. To have anything out of the ordinary occur was unusual, and his abandoning the area except for use as a paint storage area was more out of the general creepiness of the place than out of too many phenomena. He had lived in the house for 4 years, plenty of time to get used to it, mostly, and come to terms with it, and track it. Heaviest manifestations were always in late winter and early spring. Things were usually very peaceful in early fall. Occasional footsteps was about all. Anyway, that's the gist of the interview. Dinner concluded. We chatted about the house, the interview the week before, and our expectations for this visit. Frankly, I thought it was slim odds that we'd have 2 encounters in 2 visits, but it was early spring, and once again, when we went to the car for our gear, we found our batteries drained. Kevin and Jenna wanted to go down into the basement on this trip. Sarah wasn't eager to go down there again, and I didn't want to leave her alone with Woody, so I decided I'd stay up top with her. We searched the house just before nightfall, taking pictures and making sure we were alone and that nothing was out of the ordinary. When it was good and dark, and after a quick trip to the restroom, they went down. What follows is all based on their stories and writings. I didn't see any of this myself. Upon their descent, Jenna was immediately aware of the negative vibes. I've said before that she was very open-minded and had a spiritualist bent. I think she was much more perceptive and aware of this sort of thing than the rest of us. She began to feel irritated almost immediately. Kevin felt nothing besides the usual tension one feels on a ghost hunt. They quickly searched the basement, and I'd asked them to take a good look at the sawhorses to try and find the nail that Sarah tore her pants on and take pictures from all angles. I'd love to be able to say they didn't find any badly hammered nails, that something else must have caused it, but this is reality, if a bit surreal, and there was a nail on one of the horses that could have easily resulted in a tear about mid-thigh. That taken care of, they examined in detail the spot where the tapping sound had come from on the previous visit. They knocked on the wall. It seemed quite solid. They felt the ground and ceiling, both normal temperatures, no vibrations. It was just a wall. Kevin decided to stand near the bottom of the stairs. After interviewing Woody, he thought they might be a focal point for the haunting. He also wanted to stay far away from the rack, even with it lying on the floor. Jenna took up position on a sawhorse much as Sarah has done. but only after pushing the one with the bad nail into an angle where she couldn't possibly bump into it. And so their lights went out, and they waited. Sarah and I passed our time with Woody. We didn't watch TV or shoot pool because we didn't want to make any noises that the other team might misinterpret. He mostly spun yarns from his Marine days. He had 1,000,000 of them, and he was just the coolest old guy ever. Anyway, the hours passed for us, probably much quicker than for poor Kevin and Jenna. About 2 hours into the vigil, they heard the tapping sound begin. It was very faint, from the same spot as last time. Once again, lighting the room showed nothing, nor did the pictures they took, and as it was faint and intermittent, after a little while they found the courage to turn off the lights and sit in the dark again. Kevin had begun to become aware of the sense of wrong, and Jenna continued to be aware of a mounting sense of anger within her and in the room. After about half an hour of random taps, the room felt silent again. They sat for approximately another hour, and when Jenna stood up to stretch and shift position. When she dropped her hands after stretching, she banged her left hand on the sawhorse, and Kevin heard her give the sawhorse a shove and say, "Fucking c-." He was very surprised by this. Jenna wasn't a choir girl by any stretch of the imagination, but none of us have ever heard her utter the word c- before. And she said it with vigor, almost spat the word was how he described it. He talked to her for a few minutes, making sure she wasn't hurt and trying to get a sense of her emotional state. She told him she felt angry, but that was in control and that she wanted to stay down. He decided everything was fine and he also wanted to stay, so again, they felt silent and waited. Another 2 hours passed with nothing. It was now very late at night. Sarah and I were getting restless, though Woody was an inexhaustible fountain of energy. We were playing cards. I'm not a big fan of Texas Hold'em, but I loves me some 5-card draw and some tonk. Kevin began to hear a thumping sound at this point. It wasn't loud, and it was coming from over near Jenna. He held his ground, listening to it for a few moments to make sure it wasn't a trick of the imagination. Then he flicked on his lantern to find Jenna absent-mindedly pounding her right fist against the sawhorse. He called her a jerk, told her to knock it off, and switched out the light. A few minutes passed, and the pounding began again. He was about to ask Jenna what the fuck her problem was when he heard a sound directly in front of him. He said it sounded much like someone dragging their feet heavily, just as Woody had described. By this point, he was ready to lose it, but he whispered and asked Jenna if she heard the noise, and she confirmed that he did. "Well then quit fucking drumming on the sawhorse so we can hear it better." "Sorry," she said. The drumming stopped, but the dragging continued. It seemed to move away from Kevin towards the paint rack and the far opening to the back half of the basement where Jenna sat. He saw nothing, but the temperature was beginning to drop dramatically. And then again, he hears the pounding coming from Jenna's sawhorse. This time it's louder. The room is fucking freezing. He still hears something dragging its damn feet, and he's so focused on hearing it and trying to ignore the pounding that it takes him a moment to consider that perhaps he should check on Jenna. "Jenna?" he says. Her lantern comes on and she immediately bursts into tears. The dragging sound stops immediately, but it's still ice cold in the room. He switches on his lantern, books over to Jenna, and grabs her arm. It's bleeding from where she's been pounding it against the sawhorse, and she's practically hysterical, sobbing loudly. He pulls her over to the stairs, and they book it out of the basement. Sarah, Woody, and I are waiting just near the top, having heard Jenna crying, and as soon as I saw her, I ran for the first aid kit. The one time I can remember breaking the rule of never going solo for even a moment, and fuck me, running out alone into the dark on a lonely country road to retrieve a first aid kit from a car was no walk in the park itself. Ghosts, UFOs, Sasquatches, you just never know. Kevin was still pretty coherent, much more than I was when I came up the previous week, and noted in his observations later that the cold air stopped immediately at the lip of the top step. It was like passing out of a block of ice, he said. Woody at this point was deeply concerned. One of us had been hurt, though after calming her down enough to clean the wound, we saw it really wasn't that bad. She just rubbed off the first layer or two of skin and caused some capillaries to bleed. We questioned her at length. She wasn't really aware that she was pounding her fist against the sawhorse. That's why she started crying when she turned on the light and looked at her arm. The sudden realization she was hurt scared the hell out of her. She clearly remembered the temperature drop and the foot dragging sound, which had come from around the opposite side of the wall she sat facing and stopped right next to her. Throughout the night, she said she felt increasingly irritated and angry, up until the foot dragging sound started, at which point she said she felt much closer to just plain blind rage and felt a very deep resentment at whatever was making the sound. Woody was reluctant to let us continue after the injury. I told him I'd call him after we debriefed ourselves and we'd talk. And thus, part 2 is finished. I've already told you guys we went back one more time. Hopefully I can get that written up tomorrow sometime.